Hi, everybody. Can you believe it? It's FISBA Friday, and I couldn't be happier as we all slide into the weekend to learn some powerful tips around keeping those nasty pathogens from getting into our facilities and getting a hold of the food products that we make and we serve. Now, my name is Jim Albright, and you have come to the right place to hear the latest updates, insights, and guidance surrounding the Food Safety Modernization Act. This is a monthly series that's in collaboration with Safety Chain and the Acheson Group, who are the food safety and risk mitigation experts. They help food and beverage manufacturers stay in compliance and create amazing and safe food products around the globe. Now, this is your chance to interact with today's food safety experts, so be sure to submit your questions at any time during the presentation. Now, before I introduce today's speaker, I just have to cover a few program notes. First, we have muted all attending mics, but as mentioned, we are leaving room at the end of today's session for some Q&A. So again, please do submit your comments and questions during the presentation, and we'll do our best to get through them all. If we do run out of time, I promise you we will follow up separately, so don't worry. We are recording this presentation, so everybody who registered will get a link to that recording and today's presentation slides. So, all right, without further ado, let's meet today's speaker. I would like to welcome back Mary Hoffman. She's a food safety director at the Acheson Group, who had previously joined us here on FISMA Friday to discuss how food safety should be part of everyone's KPIs, as well as how to become recall ready in the eyes of the FDA. So Mary, it's great to have you back. And I know we have hundreds of people on today's call who are very anxious to hear your thoughts on how to beef up their environmental monitoring program to super secure their plants against pathogen break-ins. But why don't you start us off with a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Hi, Jim. Thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be here today. Yes, my name's Mary Hoffman. I'm a director of food safety with the Acheson Group. I've been with TAG for, I guess, about 3.5 years now, but I've worked in the food manufacturing industry for close to 20 years. My background's all been in quality assurance, quality control, food safety type positions. So I've had lots of positions, I think, much like the people who are on the call with us today. So I'm excited to talk a bit more about environmental controls and a little bit about environmental monitoring.
Awesome. All right, and we have some FISMA updates, don't we, Mary?
Yeah, why don't we start with some FISMA updates before we launch into our topic for the day. So a couple of things I wanted to call out that have happened recently is there's a couple of new FDA compliance guides available. And the first one is the Small Entity Compliance Guide for the FISMA Food Traceability Rule. So this guide describes the requirements of that regulation to assist small entities, including farms and small businesses, in complying with those record-keeping requirements of that regulation. So that rule was issued in November of 2022, and the compliance dates for record-keeping requirements is January 20th of 2026. So check that out if that applies to you. The next thing I wanted to highlight is this, the FDA released a draft compliance policy guide to provide guidance for FDA staff on their enforcement policy regarding, excuse me, major food allergen labeling and cross-contact. So this is guidance intended for FDA staff, but it's really available for anyone. And if you check it out, you can get some insights into FDA's thinking on major food allergen enforcement policy. Among the updates listed are, so the document describes labeling requirements for major food allergens and the proper use of the ingredient list and the contain statement on food allergen declarations. And it also describes requirements for preventing allergen cross-contact in facilities. And one important and interesting note is the communication that accompanied the release of that document, the allergen document, states that the FDA is aware that some manufacturers are intentionally adding sesame to products that previously did not contain sesame and are labeling the products to indicate its presence. So you're likely aware that sesame became an allergen that required labeling in January of this year. So this is a practice that we've been hearing about that's happening for those companies that are using sesame in their processes. So the FDA, again, in this email that came out accompanying this guidance document, they said, we're aware that this is happening. They're not addressing that practice in this guidance document, but they said they're engaging with stakeholders on the issue, and they recognize that this practice makes it more difficult for sesame allergic consumers to find foods that are safe for them to consume, and that is not an outcome that the FDA supports. So keep your eyes peeled if that applies to you and your facility. There may be more to come on that sesame issue. And then the last thing I just wanted to share, this VQIP portal, that's the Voluntary Qualified Importer Program. So again, this is a voluntary fee-based program that provides an expedited review and import of human and animal foods into the United States to importers who decide to use this program, and they can achieve and maintain certain requirements that go along with that program. So the application portal for fiscal year 2024 opened in January and it closes on May 31st. So if that applies to you and you intend to apply for that VQIP, you've got a few days to get that done. All right. So we'll move into our topic for the day. We are going to be talking about environmental controls. And I just wanted to start with a little bit about why this is important or why it matters. So biological hazards are the most frequently reported hazard group associated with foodborne illness. Many of you have likely seen these figures before, but they come from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And they estimate that every year in the United States, 48 million people, or 1 in 6 people, get sick. 128,000 people are hospitalized, and around 3,000 people die from foodborne illness every year in the United States. There's also a significant economic impact to businesses that are involved in foodborne illness events. So environmental controls and environmental monitoring programs that we're going to be talking about today are all about biological hazards and keeping those pathogens out of food. So we'll start with talking about kind of where do foodborne pathogens come from to begin with. We're going to take a look at 2 of the most common organisms associated with foodborne pathogen outbreaks. But when we start to talk about environmental controls, we'll be talking about, those control principles really will apply to all foodborne pathogens. So Listeria monocytogenes, this is just widely available and distributed in nature. So it can be found in soil, water, vegetation, and in the feces of some animals. It likes cold and wet areas, so that's where it sometimes can be found in food manufacturing facilities. It can be found in areas where food and water are present, and especially in sort of cracks and hard to clean areas in facilities. Listeria outbreaks have been associated with foods with a long shelf life under refrigerated conditions, and foods that are consumed without further treatment like cooking. So some examples are lunch meat, some dairy products like soft cheeses, prepared salads, and fresh fruits and vegetables. Listeria monocytogenes is of particular concern for pregnant women because it can cause miscarriage and stillbirth. So that's why you'll often hear, pregnant women shouldn't eat lunch meat, for example. And then salmonella. Salmonella is naturally found in the intestinal tract of warm-blooded animals, and it's excreted in their feces. Salmonella can tolerate heat and dry conditions. Harborage in food facilities is generally in areas where foods accumulate, and it can survive well in dry processing environments. And introducing moisture can then allow salmonella to grow. So that's why you'll often hear, keep dry areas dry if salmonella is a potential concern. Salmonella outbreaks have been associated with eggs, poultry, and other products of animal origin. Fruits, vegetables, and nuts can be contaminated during growing if good agricultural practices are not applied. And I'm sure most everyone has heard about salmonella in peanut butter outbreaks. And you think, peanuts are roasted before they're turned into peanut butter. So it's fair to think that contamination after that processing step may have occurred from the processing environment. So this highlights the importance of good environmental controls. So how do pathogens get inside of a food manufacturing facility? So we just said that pathogens are present in nature and in the guts and feces of animals. So we'll talk a little bit more about how they can make their way inside. So they can come in with raw products, ingredients, or packaging materials. And really think of everything that comes in through your doors on any given day as potentially bringing in pathogens from the outside world. So this could include, being within the ingredients or materials themselves, or from the process of transporting them to your facility. Pathogens can also come in with people, so including your employees, contractors, and visitors. And remember, we said pathogens are present in soil and animal feces, so think about what people might be dragging in on the bottom of their shoes or on their clothing. Also, people can carry pathogens in their intestinal tract, or in some cases on their skin, like with Staph aureus. Pests, like insects and rodents, can also be vectors for foodborne pathogens. So keeping pests out and not providing food and harborage areas for them is really important in food plants. Another thing that I didn't list here, but I should have, is water. So you might use water as an ingredient and also for cleaning, but also think of things like roof leaks. So literally anything that can make its way inside your facility should be assessed for its risk of introducing pathogens to your processing environment, so proper controls can be put in place. Once pathogens are inside a facility, they really can hitch a ride on people and equipment as they move around the facility. So pathogens can find niche areas or spots that are hard to reach, and they can sometimes escape your routine cleaning and sanitation activities. We talk about pathogens in a manufacturing facility being either transient or resident pathogens. So when we see transient, these are things that somehow found its way in, but you quickly eliminated it with your routine sanitation or some other activities. Whereas resident pathogens, these are the ones that have established themselves within your processing environment. So they might colonize an area of your facility that's difficult to adequately clean. So think of places like cracks in the floor, or wall-to-floor junctions that are hard to clean, drains or holes, and things like that. Ultimately, the worst thing that can happen is that the pathogens can make their way to the most sensitive areas of your facility and contaminate food and food contact surfaces, which is why it's so important to implement robust controls that we're talking about today. So at a high level, your environmental control strategy should include approaches to prevent pathogen entry into your facility, to kill or remove pathogens, to control their growth, and to control transfer of pathogens to prevent them from reaching exposed food or food contact surfaces. The way these strategies are used really varies depending on the nature of the products and processes involved. So for example, if you're using a raw ingredient that's known to carry a risk of pathogens, you might use a kill step in your process. Like maybe you'll cook eggs that you use in your product and process, for example. In those cases, separation of raw from cooked areas becomes very important. But if you're producing a ready-to-eat product that doesn't include a kill step, then really preventing entry becomes one of your largest focused areas. So we're going to talk more about many of these strategies in our upcoming slides. But generally speaking, in all facilities, regardless of product type, good, solid prerequisite programs and a strong food safety culture are critical for the production of safe food. So I want to take a look at supply chain controls. And you might not really think about supplier controls as being an environmental control. But for me, this is really one of the first ways that you can focus on keeping pathogens out of your processing environment to begin with. It's important that you understand who is controlling the hazards that are associated with your ingredients and other materials. Are you controlling the risk, the pathogen risk of ingredients, or is your supplier doing that? And if it's your supplier, you still need to understand exactly how they're controlling those hazards, and then determine how can you verify that they're doing that every time with every lot of material that you're receiving. Also consider transportation of your ingredients and your finished products. Make sure food safety requirements are clearly communicated with all of those relevant parties. We're focusing on biological hazards today, so think of things like refrigeration during transportation, trailer conditions, commingling of items on the trailer. And then also think about other external partners like third-party warehouses or co-manufacturers. So food safety expectations need to be clearly communicated with all of those parties, like who's responsible for controlling the food safety risks here, and then how are you verifying that those things are done consistently. Another important environmental control is segregation. And this can mean different things depending upon the nature of your products and your processes again. This can be separation of raw and ready-to-eat areas in some facilities. It may involve separating wet from dry areas, particularly in foods with low water activity. And segregation strategies can include things like using dedicated equipment, utensils, tools, and even dedicated personnel for certain areas based on risk. Personnel controls need to consider those functions that aren't as easily dedicated to a particular area. So I mean, think about functions like the food safety quality team or maintenance personnel, right? They might have to access different hygienic areas throughout the course of their day. So really think about how their movements might be a risk of pulling pathogens around the facility. And more importantly, how can you manage that risk? Essentially, all of these activities have the potential to carry pathogens into the higher risk areas of the facility, so they need to be controlled. And a bit more on segregation. So hygienic zoning is a concept that's often used in ready-to-eat production facilities, but it really might be a useful concept in many environments. And again, we're talking about biological hazards today, but you could think of this in terms of other hazards as well, maybe allergen cross-contact, for example. But this involves conducting an assessment of your facility, including the rooms, activities, and traffic flows, and defining hygiene requirements for different areas based on the risk of contaminating product. And we've got a bit more on hygienic zoning here on the next slide. So here is a high-level process for implementing hygienic zoning. So first, you'll define your hygiene areas based on your products and processes. And this can be something simple like low, medium, and high hygiene areas, or often we'll see kind of non-manufacturing areas, basic GMP areas, and pathogen control areas. It matters less what you call it, and it matters more that it makes sense for your facility and your risks. So then you will conduct an assessment and evaluation of a facility map and assign those hygienic definitions to each of the areas of the facility. And then you'll implement barriers and transition areas between those hygienic zones. And it's all meant to protect that highest hygiene area of the facility. Ideally, barriers could be physical things like walls that separate rooms, but it's not always the case. Sometimes it's procedural, like having designated employees who use different color uniforms for people who are allowed to access each area. And then focus on traffic. So again, people and equipment flow. The goal is to protect the highest hygiene areas of the facility where your products and your processing equipment is the most vulnerable. Another important environmental control is well-defined and communicated expectations for personnel practices. And this often includes things like hand washing and sanitizing, uniforms, eating, drinking, and tobacco use, keeping those out of processing areas. Hair coverings, restricting people who are ill from working in contact with food. You might have a glove policy, personal cleanliness. All of these things should be tailored to the hygiene area or the level of risk to product and product contact surfaces in a particular area. And in your program, you really want to emphasize the desired personnel behaviors. A lot of times you'll give some GMP training to people when they first start at your company, and then once a year you'll have refresher training. You learn a lot of things when you first are starting at a new place. It's easy to forget all of the details. So we really encourage this, continued emphasis on those desired behaviors. Keep an eye on it and provide coaching, on-the-spot coaching when you see things that aren't as they should be. Include cross-functional, like different departments in your GMP walkthroughs. Ideally, your food safety quality teams aren't the GMP police, but rather you're maybe organizing and coordinating those efforts. But you want to have cross-functional involvement in the walkthroughs. That way, people from different functions are, you're creating ownership for those programs across the board. And food safety culture, really, this is the goal, right? Is everyone should understand why these personnel practices are important and what their role is in food safety. I just want to quickly point out environmental controls related to maintenance activities. I always think of maintenance teams as they're kind of like magicians. They can fix anything, and they're really the ones that keep things moving, keep the place running. But you have to make sure that maintenance activities don't pose a food safety risk. So think about the tools that they use. They need to be regularly cleaned, inspected, and sanitized. Potentially, you should have dedicated tools to those different hygiene areas. When they're doing equipment maintenance, make sure you have controls so that the equipment, the food contact equipment, is inspected, sanitized before it's put back into use. The maintenance personnel themselves, again, they have to go into many different areas in a particular day, potentially. So make sure they understand the appropriate flow of traffic, what they need to do when they're moving in between those different hygiene areas. And then construction and maintenance planning. If you're going to have contractors in or you're doing some significant construction activity, communication is key here. You need to have food safety quality teams involved in those conversations so you can put the appropriate controls in place. If it's a long-term construction project, a lot of times you're going to have frequent meetings to talk about how things change from day to day. So you make sure, what you defined as appropriate access to the facility or, appropriate controls that might change throughout. So keeping in continual communication as the project progresses and limiting the amount of potential pathogens that are being introduced into the facility. All right, another category of environmental controls is controlled conditions. So think of these as ways we can control the growth and the transfer of pathogens if they are in the facility. So these are things like temperature controls and humidity, keeping dry areas dry, controlling and eliminating condensation, if at all possible. If condensation is there, making sure that it is not contacting your food or your food contact surfaces. Your heating, ventilation, air conditioning units need to be cleanable and accessible, and also watch those so they're not dripping water into food zones. And pay attention to high pressure water and compressed air. If you need to use those in your facility, be thinking about the potential to aerosolize any pathogens that might be kind of on the floor or further away. If you hit those with the high pressure, you can kind of send those airborne, and then they have the potential to settle on food contact surfaces. So make sure if you need to use those, you have the right controls in place. All right, a bit about sanitary design. So facilities and equipment, first and foremost, need to be cleanable. They need to be resistant to deterioration from chemicals. So think about how you're going to, what chemicals you're going to be using to clean them, for example. The facilities should be designed to address separation of hygiene areas if at all possible. So, where we said having walls between hygiene areas really is ideal. But also needs to be designed to support your sanitation practices in terms of kind of wet cleaning and dry cleaning. Able to control condensation, and again, some focus on floors, drains, walls, ceilings, and those junctions. They all need to be, smooth, cleanable, and well maintained so they don't provide those harborage areas for pathogens. A little bit about the exterior of the facility, roads, walkways, parking lots, as smooth and intact as possible. Obviously, you don't want to have kind of a big puddle of possible, pathogens hanging out where people have to walk through it every single day. So increasing the load of pathogens on the bottom of their footwear, for example. Water should drain away from the building. Walls need to be solid. They need to be intact seals around any penetrations. Vegetation control, you don't want to have kind of decorative bushes and things right up to the building. You want to have that space in between. Just, thinking about rodents and pests that might decide that's a good place to live. The roof needs to be solid, no pooling water. Entryways and openings need to be sealed, locked, and screened. Considerations for site security, so fencing, lighting, locked doors, things like that. And then equipment storage. If you are storing unused equipment outside, how are you controlling that risk that you're not going to be pulling? If you pull that equipment back into use, you're not going to be pulling in pathogens as well. So just a bit more on sanitary design. So just recognizing in reality, we're not all working in brand new facilities with brand new equipment that was designed, with the sanitary design in mind. So oftentimes you have to manage the risk associated with less than ideal sanitary conditions. This risk management should include a cross-functional team to take a look at the situation and identify, how are we going to manage this? So this could include enhanced cleaning and sanitation of a particular piece of equipment or area of the facility. Continue to inspect the area or the equipment, and maybe conduct some testing on it, to see what's happening, or additional preventive maintenance. Consider making modifications that could reduce the risk, like replacing hollow rollers with solid rollers or fixing rough welds if that's the situation. And then use data like your test results if you're doing some testing on it, or the cost of implementing those enhanced controls to determine if and when equipment replacement is justified. Water supply and plumbing controls include, using potable water. Maybe you're using municipal water, maybe you're using private well water, but understand the source of your water and who's monitoring the safety and quality of that water. Oftentimes, you can use the municipality's testing results as part of your kind of verification activities, but lots of companies will also do their own testing as indicators of continual adequacy of that water. If it's a private well, then it's likely on you really to be monitoring the quality and safety of the water. You need to prevent backflow between potable and non-potable sources. Don't forget about ice. If you're making ice for food contact, that needs to be made with potable water as well. And you need to make sure you have water supply of the appropriate temperature and pressure to conduct cleaning activities. And on cleaning and sanitation, so cleaning and sanitation programs are obviously critical programs to control environmental pathogens. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And your programs have to be tailored to the facility with considerations for sanitary design, your product profile, the history in your facility, and the degree of product exposure to the processing environment. There's a couple more on sanitation here because it's such a big program. So we often use the word sanitation to kind of talk about our cleaning and sanitation activities. And I just want to emphasize that cleaning prior to sanitizing is an important distinction to make. Cleaning really does the majority of the work to remove bacteria from surfaces. So surfaces need to be thoroughly cleaned before they are sanitized. Impurities that are left over, like dirt or grime, can make it harder for chemicals to get to, any kind of germs that are there on the surfaces. Biofilms can be formed if we're not adequately cleaning, and these are highly resistant to sanitizers. So sanitizing is kind of the final step that's done after cleaning to reduce any number of remaining germs that may be there on surfaces, but you can't really sanitize without cleaning. So your cleaning and sanitation program should include your routine cleaning activities. So these are the ones that are done at the end of every production cycle. Maybe it's daily, but not necessarily. We need to define what is going to be cleaned and think about not just the equipment, but also tools, carts, hoses, catch pans. And you need to be deliberate about how you're going to identify and store that equipment when it's clean, especially the stuff that comes apart and is cleaned out of place. You need to have a designated area so the clean equipment can't become contaminated from other activities that are going on in the environment. So then in addition to routine cleaning, you also should include your periodic cleaning. So these are things that aren't necessarily cleaned at the end of every production cycle. We often see these listed out on a master sanitation schedule like the one that's shown here. And this often includes things like infrastructure cleaning, like your floors, your walls, your overheads, ceilings, and ductwork. Really defining how often are we going to clean these areas, how are we going to do that, who's going to do it. In addition to infrastructure, This can include sort of the more in-depth cleaning you'll do on some of your equipment where you're really taking things apart, cleaning pumps and scales. All should be defined in your master sanitation program. And then the last category of sanitation, cleaning and sanitation protocols are these special cause cleanings. So you want to think ahead about what unexpected, unplanned things could happen that require additional cleaning and sanitation. So things that I have in mind here are like a roof leak or a drain backup, for example. Whenever possible, have some defined procedures for how you're going to respond to things like that. But if it's something you hadn't even considered, make sure that there's a risk assessment included in the follow-up to those events. So think through, did this thing that happened, did that potentially introduce pathogens into our processing environment? Do we need to increase our cleaning and sanitation and our environmental monitoring in these areas? Sanitation verification activities should be put in place to make sure your procedures are working as intended. As with everything, these will be tailored to your products and your processes, but it can include measuring your chemical concentrations. You might do a visual observation of the piece of equipment to make sure it looks visually clean, it smells clean. Some companies will use ATP or micro swabs as an indicator of how well the cleaning and sanitation was delivered. And then your environmental monitoring program for pathogens is also considered a sanitation verification activity. And then training is, for me, I consider this another environmental control, is personnel training. So, and for me, it's one of the most important environmental controls in a facility. Training should be personalized to each individual's role and how they contribute to food safety. Right? Explain the why behind what you're asking them to do. Explain why the programs are there and why it's important. Empower people to take ownership of food safety and engage them in the process. Strong training and communication is critical to building a strong food safety culture and to ensuring that your food is manufactured safely day in and day out, regardless of who's looking or what shift we're on. People want to do the right thing. Nobody wants to accidentally make somebody ill or injure them with the food that they are producing. So empower them to do the right thing and own food safety. And then just a couple of words on environmental monitoring. So all that being said, we talked through what are our environmental controls, and we want to talk a little bit about how does environmental monitoring fit. So your environmental monitoring program is really a verification program to determine the effectiveness of your environmental controls. So environmental monitoring itself is not a control, right? You're just taking a look at all of those controls that we talked about, and some of them are listed here: sanitary design, traffic patterns, sanitation procedures. Your environmental monitoring program should tell you, are these controls effective? Are we adequately keeping pathogens out of our facility and especially out of those high-risk areas? Right, the objective of your environmental monitoring program is to find gaps and to identify improvement opportunities in your environmental controls. Right, it'll give you a baseline assessment of your environment. It'll identify those potential sources of contamination and vectors that might spread it. It'll tell you how your sanitation practices are doing. It'll verify your segregation protocols, and it'll give you data to correct problem areas and update programs as needed. Right? You probably spend a lot of time and money on your environmental monitoring and testing programs. Make sure you're using the data that you collect to strengthen your controls. And at the end of the day, a combination of robust environmental controls and environmental monitoring is the best way to mitigate risks associated with environmental pathogens, and to help you maintain a safe food manufacturing environment. All right.
Oof, we are completely incredibly amazed. Mary, this was a really, really great overview, and there is obviously a lot of stuff that we can dive into. But I think it was just good to hear some of the examples that you provided. We're getting some questions popping in now, and throughout the presentation, we've been getting questions in. So I think this definitely was a good topic for everybody today. I'd like to start off with, you had mentioned at the top when we were talking about Listeria as being one of the more major pathogens that are found. And you had mentioned cracks and hard to clean places. And I know you kind of discussed it, but it's kind of hard. You don't know what you don't know. So if you're not aware of a crack, or if you're not aware of something that might potentially be a place for a resident pathogen to live, and try as you might, how can you possibly cover all the bases when again there's unseen risk? Is there some
Yeah,
cues or best practices that you can offer here?
yeah, and that's real, right? And like, everything I said it's real easy for me to say it. The challenge is in implementing it, and every one of the environmental controls we touched on could be a training session, and it often is on its own. But really great question. So I think the specific question about how on earth am I supposed to find every single crack in my facility that might be harboring Listeria, some of that will come down to your environmental monitoring program. So having identify appropriate frequencies and locations for your environmental monitoring and testing for Listeria in your environment can tell you a lot. So, if you do receive a positive result for your environmental monitoring for Listeria, for example, your follow-up investigation is going to be key. So what are you doing then? Are you conducting vector swabs to try to understand where is this coming from, and is this living in our processing environment? Did you just do some extra cleaning and sanitation, you did your vector swabs and it's gone, and we haven't had a positive again? Well, then likely that was just a transient thing, kind of a one-off. But if you keep getting positives in your environmental monitoring, you potentially have a resident strain, and that's where it becomes really important to start looking for those potential harborage areas like cracks and hard to clean areas. So again, it's easier said than done. It's a lot of work, but you just have to be, very structured and deliberate about your environmental monitoring.
Yeah, and there was a theme here around food safety culture, which again everybody's aware of on this webinar, but also just simple things like you brought up the use of high pressure sprays could send pathogens elsewhere. So that's in itself a training how to properly spray, not to spray a certain way, or control that environment in which you're spraying, control how you're spraying, and make sure that it's not essentially going into an area that's uncontrolled. So
Yep.
interesting.
A lot
The
of times with those too, that's a conversation that we have with lots of folks because, for one reason or another, they need to use, some sort of pressure in their activities. And, then oftentimes we'll suggest, all right, do a study, conduct some sort of microbiological study of the impact of that activity.
right,
Just understand what the risks are, and then you can put controls in place so it doesn't impact your food.
right, right. Everything is learning and evolving. You just got to keep looking at it. Yeah, it's
And
funny.
that's just it. You're never really done with food safety programs. It's not like something you put together once and implement it, and okay, good, now we did food safety, right? You're
Yeah.
continually monitoring and understanding where can we improve, what else do we need to do, what don't, sometimes it's what don't we need to do anymore. We did that thing and we resolved it, and all of our monitoring tells us that's under control. So, maybe you focus your efforts elsewhere.
Yep. It's Nathan just put this. He says, I remember there was a saying I heard a long time ago. It said, if you can't find genius listeria in your plant, you're not looking hard enough.
Yeah,
Yep, so
yeah,
true.
I'm with you. And that's a really great point. Like, if it's there, you want to find it, right? You want to find it before somebody else finds it. And somebody else might find it by eating your food that you didn't know
Hmm.
listeria was in it. That's where, or regulators could come in and do a swabathon and maybe they would find it. So yeah, if it's there, you want to be looking to find it yourself so you can get rid of it.
Yep. Is there any, I guess, particular protocols around the use of PPE or personal protective equipment? So, for example, like, can I wear a beanie instead of head gear?
Um, those are the kinds of questions that I generally respond with it depends.
It depends.
I have seen places who will allow people to wear like a beanie with a hairnet over the top,
Hmm. Hmm.
things like that. But you really have to consider, what are your products? What are your processes? What are the risks from hair? And how can you best control those risks?
Right. Let's move on to suppliers or supply chain controls. You started the presentation there as well. And I know you had mentioned packaging, but we didn't actually dive in. Could you give an example of potential risks coming in through, say, a packaging material into your food plant?
Yeah, so the packaging material itself needs to be part of your risk assessment. So you can be looking at, biological, chemical, physical potential risks associated with that packaging. Um, you need to understand, is that packaging itself made in a food safe manner? Is that manufacturer using like a third party GFSI type audit program to make sure that they're maintaining sanitary environment themselves? And really the risk, again, sorry, but it depends on what kind of packaging you're using. Are you using plastic jars? Are you using paper, lined paper bags? Are you using glass, which has its own set of hazards? So at the end of the day, it comes down to that biological, chemical, physical risk assessment, determining what's significant, what requires a control, and then who's controlling that hazard.
Right. I'm going to take us back to GMP training. And obviously, I think we all can say yes, it needs to be more regular. It needs to be just beyond just the initial onboarding of a new employee. Um, how do you how do you suggest maybe putting some control or monitoring system around food safety culture? How do you know that you're still um, maintaining alignment throughout the plant and beyond the plant, right? Because I think you even brought up um, even office workers could take
Yeah,
part in a food safety culture. So how do we build a mechanism? That's maybe a loaded question, but any advice would be
yeah.
helpful.
I feel like there were kind of two things there. There was one part of it was about training, which obviously is
Hmm.
very closely connected to food safety culture, but then food safety culture itself and monitoring is a whole nother thing. I've got a couple of thoughts, and I hope that I'm getting to what the question was. So, how do you make sure that this is staying front of mind and, not just doing the annual training?
Right.
We often have worked with clients that have had really great proactive and engaging programs for food safety. Where they'll have kind of a food safety topic of the week or a food safety topic of the month, or they'll have, examples. They'll put pictures up on the boards and what's wrong with this picture, but that they're basing that on what they're observing in the plant. Like all of a sudden we see that people are really taking shortcuts when it comes to maybe washing their hands. They're
Hmm.
barely giving them a rinse or whatever. So if they see that, then they'll build some more trainings about it. And here's the explain again. Here's the proper procedure for washing hands. Here's why it's important. Some places will even take swabs of people's hands if they volunteer. You want to be careful about that kind of thing. You could swab your own hands, or you could show pictures, um, not knowing who the person's hand was, for example, but just to really drive home the why, um, and what people really need to do in order to manage that risk. And you can, try to make it fun, try to make it interactive as much as possible.
Yeah, real examples, real life examples, that makes a lot of sense, and getting that context built in. It's funny because you brought in the example HVAC units. Make sure, they're not dripping on an area that you're producing the food. And again, you may not be aware, you're not an HVAC person, you know nothing about HVAC systems, but just having that sort of be top of mind, food safety, it's part of the culture of the business. You're going to be more aware of things like a dripping HVAC unit. So that's
Yeah.
very cool.
And I
Yeah.
know an example from my past, which is not, it's kind of embarrassing, but I'm going to share it because none of us are perfect. And it just kind of highlights an important part. In my past, I was in my routine environmental monitoring. I realized we were getting pathogens in an area of the facility where employees sometimes were able to enter. It wasn't the main entry, but it was kind of a secondary entry that we hadn't really adequately addressed. So I decided, oh, we just need to put a floor foamer over there. It was a pretty wet environment. We were using floor foamers for footwear control. We'll just put in a new floor foamer over there. There's a drain, it won't be too big of a deal. So we installed the floor foamers. And then they were in place, and I decided to go out there a couple days later to see how it was working. And I saw that people were kind of stepping over the foam or
Mhm.
trying to jump over because I hadn't gone out and explained to them what this was. This is going to look different over here, and why it's there and what it's doing. So like that training and the explaining the why is just crucial to all of your food safety controls and efforts.
Yeah, and like you said before, explaining the why is the most important thing, because even if I'm not directly involved in the production of making food, I still need to know why these things are put in place and why it's important. You mentioned the bushes on the side, the parking lot as you're walking into the facility. Just being aware of those risks makes me think extra twice and three times and four times as I'm walking in. Am I actually following the protocols that I was trained on? It's
Yeah.
very important. Yeah, it's good.
I think the other part of the person's question was about measuring food safety culture, and
Yes.
that is a big question. That's a tricky question, and lots of people are answering that. And that one definitely deserves a webinar of its own. But just really in brief, it generally you'll need to use a number of different approaches to actually get a good picture of the food safety culture in your facility or your company. And you'll include things like those, a lot of times you'll do surveys where people will answer questions, but you don't, that'll give you a good picture of what people are thinking and their perceptions of things. You don't necessarily want to use that alone. You want to balance that with evaluating kind of the delivery of programs, food safety programs that are proactive, um, things that you have in place. Measure the delivery of those. How are those looking? Along with potentially, interviewing different people to find out more about their thoughts and perceptions and experiences with food safety in that facility. It's a big, long, hard topic, and I understand the struggle.
Right. How does data play into that though? Again, because you don't know what you don't know, so you need some way to visualize that all of these procedures, protocols, all of the trainings, all of that work and effort that you're putting in to maintain a safe environment is paying off. So is there, I know you had a couple of examples before, but is there anything that you can provide or resources maybe that you've used to help people better visualize the food safety element or the food safety culture element within their facilities?
Well, I will say that one of my previous FSMA Friday presentations was on metrics and key performance indicators in terms of food safety. So I'm sure that um, recording is available on the Safety Chain site.
Yep,
But when you build those programs, it's just really important that you're measuring, you're communicating measurements that are driving the desired behaviors in your workforce. So what I mean by that is if you wanted to implement a metric in relation to your environmental monitoring program, you could say, we want to receive positives in less than 10% of the samples that we test. If you think that through, that objective might not be encouraging the desired behavior in that program. Like we said, if the pathogens are there, you want to find them. You should almost
right.
celebrate getting a positive because you found it. So a better metric might be related to, performing all of those tests according to the plan, maintaining the program or maintaining, completing your sanitation schedule according to plan. That encourages you to do the thing, to actually implement the control.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And just a reminder to everybody, we will follow up with the replay of this webinar, and we will attach the link to watch the replay of that KPI webinar that Mary had done for us. I think it was about a year ago. So questions are still piling in, and I think we're running out of time here, Mary. So I'm going to promise everybody that we didn't get your question answered. We will follow up. I will send Mary all of the questions, and we'll make sure we get back to you very, very soon. Um, Mary, thank you again. This was a very, very good webinar to help get us back aligned into some of the things that we know are important, but need to really maybe hunker down and focus on a little bit more. I would absolutely love to have you back on. We'll talk a little bit more about food safety culture and even some of these controls and methodologies that you explained here. So I'm going to leave it here. The Acheson Group, they are your resource when it comes to food safety, when it comes to risk management. Please do check them out at achesongroup.com. They have a ton of resources, guides, templates, things that you can actively use today to help make your food safety program even better. Of course, you can always go to safetychain.com to read some other resources that we collaborate with TAG on. We have this guide here you can see on the food traceability rule that just came out in finalized form. Do check us out at safetychain.com. All right, everybody. Well, I am going to close it out. I hope you have a great, great weekend. Happy Memorial Day. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you real soon. Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you. Bye-bye.